The auction hall in Harlan County, Kansas, smelled the way it always did in October. Dry hay and diesel, and the particular sharpness of men who had been working since before sunrise. Folding chairs scraped against concrete floors. Coffee went cold in styrofoam cups. The auctioneer cleared his throat at the front of the room, shuffled a stack of index cards, and said something that made the entire building go quiet. Not the polite quiet of people listening. The other kind. The kind that happens when a number is so large it takes a moment for the human brain to accept it as real. Nora Voss was standing at the back of the room near the fire exit. She was 46 years old the spring she came home. She was 56 now. She was wearing the same mud-caked muck boots she had worn every morning for the past decade. Her hair had gone mostly silver. There were calluses on both palms that no amount of washing ever fully cleaned. She looked like a woman who had spent 10 years doing something everyone around her believed was impossible. Because she had. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The number can wait. The number will mean nothing unless you understand the land and the woman, and the 10 years that made that room go silent. Go back to March of 2011. Go back to the day Nora Voss drove her 12-year-old pickup down the county road that ran along the eastern edge of her family's farm and pulled over at the field gate that nobody ever opened anymore. She sat in the truck for a long time before she got out. The field beyond the gate was 19 acres of low ground that ran alongside Harlan Creek. It was the kind of land that defied easy description because it was not quite one thing or another. It was not a pond. It was not a meadow. It was not a marsh exactly, though it behaved like one for 6 months. Out of every year when the creek rose and the water table pushed up through the clay subsoil, and the whole 19 acres became a shallow, slow-moving sheet of brown water. In spring it smelled of mud and rotting reed stems, and something older and darker underneath the particular smell of peat that has been wet and dry and wet again for a very long time. The soil pH sat between 4.1 and 4.4. That is the kind of acidity that kills most cultivated crops before they can establish roots. The water table in the lowest sections was less than 18 inches below the surface, even in dry summers. The county extension office had surveyed it twice in the previous 30 years, and both times had written the same word in their reports: marginal. Walter Voss, Nora's father, used a different word. He called it the dead ground. He had been calling it that for as long as Nora could remember. Walter was 74 years old that spring. He was a big man, or had been stooped now from decades of bending over wheat rows and checking soil moisture by pressing 2 fingers into the earth, the way a doctor checks a pulse. His family had farmed this land in Harlan County for 4 generations. They grew winter wheat. Hard red winter wheat, the kind that went into bread and pasta across 6 states. The kind that the Kansas plains had been growing since the first homesteaders broke the native grass in the 1880s. Walter knew wheat the way some men know scripture. He knew its growth stages and its diseases and its particular vulnerabilities to late frost. He knew which corners of his fields drained first and which held moisture longest. He knew his land, but the 19 acres along the creek he had given up on before Nora was born. His father had tried to plant wheat there in the early 1950s and lost 2 seasons in a row to standing water. He had trucked in drainage tile, the old clay kind, and laid it by hand across the low ground, and the tile had sunk into the peat and been swallowed within a decade. Walter himself had tried one more time in the late 1980s, hauling in several hundred tons of agricultural lime to raise the pH, spreading it across the field with a rented broadcaster over 3 consecutive falls. The lime vanished into the peat like sugar into water. The pH barely moved. The creek kept rising every March, and the water kept sitting in the low ground through May, and the reeds kept growing back thicker every year, and Walter eventually stopped walking down there at all. He paid the property taxes on it, $83 a year, slightly less than that for a while, and slightly more in recent years out of legal obligation. In his mind, the 19 acres had ceased to exist as farmland. It was a void. It was evidence that not everything could be fixed by the right inputs and enough work. It offended him in a way he could not fully articulate, the way an unresolvable problem offends a man who has solved problems his entire life. Nora grew up knowing her father's feelings about the low ground. She also grew up knowing that her father was wrong. She had not always known it. She had simply felt it the way children feel things they do not have language for, standing at the field gate on summer evenings, watching the red-winged blackbirds work the reed beds and the water glinting through the stalks. There was something alive down there that did not need fixing. She did not know how to say that to her father. She had not known how to say it for 30 years. She had left Harlan County at 18 and gone east to study botany at a small college in Ohio, then north to the University of Wisconsin for a doctorate in wetland ecology. She had spent the next 18 years working for a federal conservation organization, doing restoration assessments on degraded wetlands across the upper Midwest. She had stood in hundreds of fields that looked like failures and understood what they actually were. She had learned to read land the way her father read wheat, not by what it was producing, but by what it was trying to become. She came home because her mother got sick. She stayed because her mother died in November of 2010. And by the time Nora had cleaned out the bedroom and sorted the paperwork, she realized the farm was in worse shape than she had known. Walter had taken on debt to replace equipment in 2008, and the loan was still running. The wheat operation was profitable but thin. There was no cushion. She had been home for 3 weeks when she found the tin. It was in the bottom of her mother's cedar chest underneath 2 quilts and a stack of letters bound with kitchen twine. A small tin box, the kind that used to hold throat lozenges painted dark green, with a lid that had been sealed shut with a thin line of candle wax at some point in the distant past. Someone had written 4 words on a strip of adhesive tape across the top. The handwriting was very old, the letters formed with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned penmanship from a teacher, who believed it mattered. The words said, "For the low ground." Nora held it for a long time before she opened it. Inside were 2 things: a folded piece of paper, thin as onion skin, and a small cloth bag tied shut with a piece of string. The bag contained seeds, dark, irregular, roughly the size of long-grain rice. She recognized them immediately. She had spent enough time in the wetlands of northern Wisconsin to know wild rice when she held it in her palm. The paper was a note written in the same hand as the tape. The ink had faded to brown. It took her a few minutes to read it through completely. The note was from Ida Voss, her great-grandmother. Ida had come to Kansas in 1901 as the young wife of Nora's great-grandfather, a homesteader who had grown up in the wheat country and never questioned what land was for. Ida had grown up in the marshlands of northern Wisconsin near the lake country, where the Ojibwe people had harvested wild rice for centuries before anyone else arrived, where the shallow lakes turned bronze and gold every September, with the grain that grew from their surfaces without being planted or tended, in any way that the wheat farmers of Kansas would have recognized as farming. Ida had watched the low ground along Harlan Creek from the day she arrived and known what it was. She had recognized the pH, the peat, the constant shallow water, the specific combination of conditions that wild rice required to grow. She had brought seeds with her from Wisconsin. She had tried in her first years on the farm to tell her husband what she saw. He had been kind about it and completely unmoved. The low ground was for drainage tile, he said. They were wheat people. She had kept the seeds anyway. She had written the note sometime late in her life, addressed to no one in particular, to whoever in the family might one day be willing to listen. She had left it in the tin, and the tin in the cedar chest, and the cedar chest to time. Nora read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the tin, put the tin in her jacket pocket, and walked down to the field gate. That was the morning she stood by the truck for a long time before getting out. She spent the next 3 weeks on the low ground. She wore knee-high rubber boots and carried a soil auger and a notebook. She tested pH at 16 points across the 19 acres and recorded the readings in a grid. She measured the depth to the water table with a hand probe at a dozen locations. She walked the perimeter of the field twice a day at different times, morning and late afternoon, watching where the light fell and how the water moved, and where the frost settled longest in the low depressions. She cataloged the existing vegetation, the reed canary grass, and the sedges and the stands of cattail that had colonized the wettest areas. She took water samples from the creek and from 3 locations in the field and sent them to a lab at Kansas State. The results confirmed what she already knew. Wild rice required water. It required shallow water with good movement, not stagnant. It required acidic soil of pH between 4.5 and 7.5, though it thrived in the lower end of that range. It required a frost-free growing season of roughly 90 days after flooding. The 19 acres along Harlan Creek met every one of those requirements and had been meeting them without anyone noticing for the better part of a century. She came to the dinner table one evening in early April with her notebooks and her lab reports and the tin box. Walter was at the other end of the table going over seed invoices. She said she wanted the low ground. He looked up slowly. He had the expression of a man who was not sure he had heard correctly. She said she wanted him to deed it to her. She wanted to build a wild rice bog. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man rearranging his understanding of a conversation he thought he knew how to have. Walter set down his pen. He looked at her notebooks, at the tin box, at his daughter's face. He said, "Wild rice." She said, "Wild rice." He said it again, not as a question, more as a man testing the weight of a phrase he had never expected to say at his own kitchen table. He looked out the window toward the dark field. Then he said, "That is the dead ground, Nora. Nothing grows down there." She opened the notebook to the page with the pH grid. She showed him the water table measurements. She explained in the precise and patient language of someone who had spent 2 decades studying exactly this, why the 19 acres were not broken farmland, but intact wetland habitat that happened to be ideally suited to a specific high-value crop that currently sold for between $2 and $4 a pound in natural food markets from Chicago to Boston. Walter listened. He was a man who had always been willing to hear an argument on its merits. He sat quietly through the whole explanation. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "We are a wheat farm. We have been a wheat farm for 100 years. Your grandfather broke that ground with a borrowed mule, and we have put wheat in it every year since. That is what this land is." She said, "The high field is a wheat farm. The low ground has never grown a single bushel of wheat. It has been rejecting wheat for 100 years. I'm not asking you to change what the farm is. I'm asking for the 19 acres that the farm never wanted in the first place." He was quiet again for longer this time. Then he said, "You have $190,000 in that conservation account you never spend." She said, "$194,000. He said, "You want to put it in the ground down there." She said, "I want to build something that fits the ground." He stood up from the table. He was a big man, and when he stood, the room felt smaller. He said what he always said when he had lost an argument. He was not ready to concede. He said he needed to think about it. Then he walked out of the kitchen. The deed was transferred 11 days later. He did not do it quietly. Walter Voss had lived in Harlan County for 74 years, and he had opinions about things, and he shared them with people, and he was not a man who did anything without witnesses. He called the county notary, and he called 2 neighbors, and he called Gene Pritchard, who had farmed the land to the north for 40 years. And he had them all come to the kitchen on a Tuesday morning. He signed the deed at the kitchen table with 5 people watching. Before he signed, he said loudly enough that everyone in the room could hear it clearly, "I am giving my daughter 19 acres of the most useless ground in Harlan County, Kansas. If she wants to put her life savings into a swamp, that is her legal right, and I will not stand in the way of it. But everyone here is a witness that I told her exactly what I think of this plan." He signed. He slid the paper across to the notary without looking at Nora. Nora picked up the deed. She had the tin box in the inside pocket of her jacket. She said, "Thank you," and she meant it for more than the signature, though she did not say that part out loud. She walked outside to her truck. Gene Pritchard followed her out. He was a quiet man, 70 years old, who had known Nora since she was 6. He stood by the truck door for a moment. He said, "You know what people are going to say." She said, "I know." He said, "Not just the ones inside, the whole county." She said, "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded once and went back inside. Nora drove down the county road to the field gate and stood looking at the 19 acres for a while in the pale spring light. She was thinking about Ida. She was thinking about the note in the tin. She was thinking about how long a piece of knowledge could sit in a cedar chest, waiting for the right person to find it. She was not thinking about Derek Cale. She had not met Derek Cale yet. That would come in June. The work began in April. Nora hired 2 men from the County brothers named Roy and Denny Marsh, who had done earthwork and drainage contracting for 15 years, and who did not ask questions about what she was building as long as the invoices cleared. She pulled every dollar from the conservation account. She arranged a loan from a rural credit union 2 counties east at an interest rate that made her wince every time she thought about it. In total, she had approximately $230,000 to spend on 19 acres of ground that the county extension office had written off as marginal. The work was slow and expensive and drew attention from the first day the equipment arrived on Hemlock Creek Road. They began by removing the existing vegetation. The reed canary grass came out in long mats, the root systems releasing a dark, wet smell as the excavator bucket turned them over. Then, the leveling. The excavator worked for 2 full weeks, scraping the 19 acres to a uniform grade with a tolerance of less than 1 inch across the entire field, because wild rice required consistent water depth, and water depth required level ground, and level ground in a natural wetland required machines and time, and a great deal of money. They built low earthen dikes between each section wide enough to drive a tractor on. They sculpted the perimeter to hold water at a controlled depth of 12 to 18 inches. Then came the water infrastructure, a pump system, miles of pipe, a 4-acre reservoir in the lowest corner of the property excavated 8 feet deep, designed to hold the winter rainfall and the spring creek overflow that the farm had been trying to drain away for 100 years. 2 electric pumps to move water in and out of the growing sections on a schedule. Then, the substrate. 6 inches of peat reclaimed from the excavation spread back across the sections. Then, sand. Truck after truck for 11 days, 43 loads of coarse river sand. A 4-inch layer over the peat. The sand alone cost $67,000. Walter watched from the porch of the main house without comment. The neighbors did not watch without comment. They stopped their trucks on the county road and got out and leaned on the fence and watched the equipment and talked among themselves. A woman with a doctorate was spending her entire savings to put sand on top of mud next to a creek that flooded every spring. This was discussed at the co-op, at the diner, at the grain elevator in the particular tone that small agricultural communities use when someone is doing something they believe will end in humiliation. Roy told her what people were saying. He said it matter-of-factly, not to be cruel, because he thought she should know. She said, "What are they calling it?" He thought about it for a second. He said, "Nora's mud pit." She nodded. She said, "All right. Let us make it the best mud pit in Kansas." He laughed. It was the first time she had made anyone laugh since she came home. Derek Cale arrived in June. He was 36 years old, thin, and wore Blundstone boots that had never touched actual mud. He drove a late-model pickup with the logo of the Harlan Creek Growers Cooperative on the door and carried a laptop bag over one shoulder. He had a master's degree in agronomy from Purdue and an MBA from Kansas State, and he had spent 8 years consulting for agricultural operations across the Central Plains before the cooperative hired him to modernize the valley's farming operations and help them compete in a market that was, as he had explained to the board, evolving rapidly. He came to the low ground because he had heard about it, and because he believed with the serene confidence of a man whose expertise had never been seriously challenged that he could help. He found Nora at the new reservoir taking water samples. She was in mud-caked boots with her hair tied back and a notebook in one hand, and she looked exactly like what she was a scientist doing fieldwork. He introduced himself. He gestured at the sand and the dikes and the pump equipment with the expression of a man surveying a problem he had already diagnosed. He said he had run the numbers on the parcel. He said the pH could be corrected. He said with the right drainage investment and the appropriate rootstock, possibly a soybean variety engineered for wet feet, she could have this ground producing a reliable commodity crop within 3 years. His projections showed potential revenue of around $6,200 per acre at maturity. He said all of this with the calm authority of a doctor reading a chart. She let him finish. Then she said, "This land does not want to grow soybeans. It has been explaining that to my family for 100 years. He smiled the way people smile when they think patience is the appropriate response to irrationality. He said that land did not want things. Data indicated optimal uses, and this land was a correctable management problem. She said, "I have my own data." She held up the notebook. He looked at it the way some men look at handwritten notes, as if the absence of a screen made the information less reliable. He said, "When this does not work out, call me. There is still time to salvage the investment and put this ground into production." He left his card on the edge of the truck tailgate. She did not pick it up. She watched him drive back up the county road toward the co-op, his tires throwing a small plume of dust that hung in the June air for a moment, and then settled. She went back to her water samples. That fall she planted. She did not use commercially cultivated wild rice seed from an agricultural supplier. She used the descendants of the seeds from Ida's tin. She had spent 2 years before coming home cultivating them in trays in her apartment in Madison, selecting for the plants that produced the heaviest grain and the darkest color propagating from the strongest specimens, building a seed stock from the original material that had been sitting in a cedar chest for decades. She and Roy and Denny planted by hand across all 19 acres, pressing the seed into the wet sand substrate at the waterline. It was slow work. It took 6 weeks. When they finished, the field looked like nothing. It looked like an expensive flat pan of wet sand, with a few thousand barely visible green threads pushing up through the surface. Gene Pritchard stopped his truck on the county road one afternoon in October and looked at the field for a long time. He called out, "How is it going?" She said, "Slow." He said, "What does it look like when it is working?" She said, like water covered in grain. He looked at the flat pan of wet sand. He looked at her. He drove on without saying anything else. The first winter was about water management and patience. She checked the pump system every morning before dawn. She monitored water depth with a rod she had installed at the center of each section, driving out in the pre-dawn dark, with a flashlight reading the mark adjusting the intake, or the outflow by a fraction. She kept meticulous records in the notebook temperatures and pH levels and water depth and the weather and the condition of the seedlings. Every measurement went into the notebook in her handwriting in pencil, with the date and the time. She did not use a computer for the field records. She had tried that in her first conservation job and found that the act of writing by hand forced her to observe more carefully, to notice what a cursor on a screen did not require her to notice. Her notebooks from those 18 years of wetland work filled 3 shelves in the room she used as an office. They were the record of everything she had learned about how water moved through land. The loan payment was due the first of every month. It came out of her account automatically, and she watched the balance decline the way a person watches the fuel gauge on a long drive through empty country. The cooperative held its winter meeting in January. Derek Cale presented his modernization plan to the membership. He proposed that the valley's primary producers, about 22 farming operations, including the Voss wheat operation, move toward a coordinated commodity strategy centered on a new high-yield soybean variety being promoted by a company called Meridian Agri Group. The contract terms were attractive. Guaranteed purchase price for the first 3 years, access to Meridian's proprietary seed stock, and agronomic support. Cale had the numbers on a screen behind him, and they were good numbers. Walter attended the meeting. So did Gene Pritchard and most of the other operators in the valley. At the end of the presentation, someone asked about the water supply for the expanded soybean operation, which would require more irrigation than wheat. Cale said the valley had adequate water resources. He proposed a coordinated water management plan that would pool access to the various water sources across the member properties. Someone asked, "What about the reservoir on the Voss low ground?" Cale said, "That is a private water resource currently, but all options for cooperative water management should remain on the table for future discussion." Walter sat in his folding chair and did not say anything. The proposal did not pass that night. It needed more votes than Cale had, but it did not fail either. It was tabled for further discussion. The water question was tabled with it. Nora was not at the meeting. She was at the field checking the water depth by flashlight, writing the number in her notebook. She did not find out about the water discussion until Roy mentioned it 2 weeks later. The way he mentioned things he thought she should know, matter-of-factly without drama. She stood at the edge of the reservoir and looked at the water and thought about it for a while. Then she went back to work. By the spring of 2012, the first real growth was visible. The wild rice had established across roughly 60% of the planted area. The survivors were vigorous, pushing up through the water in the sections she kept flooded, at 14 inches reaching toward the surface in the particular slow urgency of a plant that knows exactly what it needs and has finally found it. The sections that were not establishing, she receded, pulling the substrate data from her notebook to understand why certain areas had underperformed. She spent her days on the dikes between sections, watching, measuring, adjusting. She was rarely inside before dark. She was rarely inside much after that either. The office was piled with notebooks and soil reports and water management manuals. She made her own meals, usually something simple and fast, and ate them standing at the kitchen window looking out toward the field. Walter watched her come and go from the main house. He did not ask how it was going. She did not tell him. They ate dinner together twice a week and talked about the wheat operation and the equipment and the weather. And they did not talk about the 19 acres. Once in the fall of 2012, he drove past the field gate and stopped. She was out on the far dike adjusting a water gate. He sat in his truck for a while. She could see him from the field. He did not get out. After a few minutes, he drove on. She went back to the water gate. The second summer, 2013, was the first harvest. It was not much of a harvest by any commercial standard. The young plants produced grain, but not in volume. She and Roy and Denny harvested it the old way by hand, bending over the water in the sections she had partially drained, combing the grain off the stalks into flat-bottomed boats. The total yield was roughly 7,000 pounds. She sold it to a specialty grocer in Wichita for $2 a pound. Gross revenue, $14,000. Operating costs for the year, not counting her own labor, which she did not count because she could not afford to think about it that way, yet $38,000. The math was not good. She knew it was not good. She had known from the beginning that wild rice did not produce commercially viable yields until the bog was fully established, which took 3 to 4 years after planting, sometimes 5. She had planned for this. The plan required her to watch the loan balance decline every month and not panic. Derek Cale mentioned the $14,000 gross revenue at the cooperative's winter meeting. He presented it as a data point. He did not say her name. He said a recent local attempt at alternative wetland cropping produced a first-year yield of approximately 700 pounds per acre, generating revenue of roughly $14,000 from 19 acres. The comparable yield from the same acreage in optimized soybean production would have been approximately $118,000. He did not say the words Nora's mud pit. He did not need to. He let the numbers say it for him. Nora was not at the meeting. She had not been to a cooperative meeting since she came home. She did not need to be in the room when her failure was being described to know that it was happening. She was at the field. It was a cold January evening, and the water in the sections was beginning to show ice at the edges, and the wild rice had gone dormant under the surface, and the whole 19 acres looked in the gray winter light exactly like what Walter had always called it. She stood on the main dike with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the dormant field for a while. She was not panicking. She was doing the calculations she had done every month since she started running the numbers against the establishment timeline she had written out in the first notebook, checking where she actually was against where she had projected she would be. The numbers were not good, but they were not outside the range she had planned for. The establishment was proceeding on schedule. The plants that had survived the first 2 seasons were strong. The substrate was performing correctly. She took out the notebook and wrote the water depth reading and the date and the air temperature. Then she walked back up the county road to the house in the dark. She had 4 more years of this ahead of her before the field would reach full production. She knew that. The knowing did not make it smaller. It made it a fact the way a long winter is a fact, and you put your head down and you go through it. She was not thinking about the auction hall. She was not thinking about the silence that would one day fall over a room full of people when a number was read aloud. She was thinking about a woman named Ida who had come to Kansas in 1901 and looked at a wet and acid field along a creek and seen something that no one else in her family had been able to see. For 110 years, she was thinking, I hear you. She put the notebook in her jacket pocket and went inside. The years do not always announce themselves when they are changing you. Sometimes you only know it later, looking back at a particular winter morning or a particular harvest, and understanding that something shifted in that season that you did not have words for at the time. For Nora Voss, the years between 2014 and 2017 were that kind of years. They were years of incremental and unglamorous progress. They were years of monthly loan payments and quiet mornings on the dike and notebooks filling with handwritten numbers that slowly, season by season, began to tell a different story than the one the county believed. The 2014 harvest was better, 12,000 pounds from 19 acres. Still not profitable. Still a data point that Derek Cale could use at a cooperative meeting to illustrate the folly of emotional decision-making in agriculture. But Nora had stopped measuring the harvest against the cooperative's expectations. She was measuring it against the establishment curve she had mapped in her first notebook. The projection she had drawn by hand and pencil in the spring of 2011, based on research data and her own field observations. And the 2014 harvest landed almost exactly where that line said it would. She wrote the number in the notebook and turned the page. Roy noticed the change in the field before she mentioned it. He came to her one morning in late July of 2015 and said he thought she should walk the northwest corner. She followed him out along the main dike to the section where the peat ran deepest, where she had measured the lowest pH readings during her original survey. The wild rice in that section was taller than anywhere else in the field. The stalks were thick and close together. The grain heads hanging heavy and dark, almost black at the tip, where the hull split open. It looked different from the rest of the harvest. It looked like something that had found exactly the conditions it had been waiting for. She pulled several heads and crushed the grain between her fingers. The color was deeper than standard wild rice, closer to a very dark brown than the typical greenish tan. She put a small sample in a collection bag and wrote the location on the label. She sent it to the plant science laboratory at Kansas State, along with samples from 4 other sections of the field. She asked them to run a full nutritional analysis. The results came back in September, 2 weeks before the 2015 harvest. The grain from the northwest corner was not simply wild rice in the conventional sense. The combination of the deep peat substrate, the specific water chemistry of that section of Harlan Creek, and what Nora believed was the particular genetic character of Ida's original seed stock, had produced a grain with measurably higher protein content and a concentration of antioxidant compounds that the laboratory report flagged as unusual. The researchers noted they had not seen comparable values in standard cultivated wild rice samples. They suggested further testing. Nora read the report at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then, she put it in the manila folder with the rest of the field documentation and went out to begin the harvest. The 2015 harvest was 31,000 pounds total. She had enough capital by then to invest in a proper harvesting boat, a flat-bottomed aluminum craft with an electric motor, and a mechanical knockbar that combed the grain off the stalks as the boat moved through the flooded sections. She and Roy and Denny worked the field in 3 days. The grain from the northwest corner she kept separate, bagged and labeled, stored in a different part of the equipment shed. She was beginning to understand that she was not just growing wild rice. She was growing a specific expression of a specific piece of ground, something shaped by 100 years of flooding and chemistry, and the particular character of Ida's seeds, something that did not exist anywhere else. She did not tell anyone this. She wrote it in the notebook and kept working. The cooperative that year was deep into the Meridian Agri-Group relationship. The soybean contracts had been running for 3 seasons, and the numbers were solid. Derek Cale had become something close to indispensable to the Valley's larger operators. He was at every meeting, every field day, every county extension event. He spoke with the fluency of a man who had memorized not just the data, but the rhythm of how farming people received information, slowly through demonstration and repetition, through seeing numbers that matched what they already half believed. He had also, though Nora would not learn this until much later, begun receiving a consulting retainer from Meridian Agri-Group in addition to his cooperative salary. The retainer was not disclosed to the cooperative board. It was not disclosed to anyone. It was a private arrangement between Cale and a regional representative at Meridian, formalized in a brief email exchange and paid quarterly into an account that was not connected to his consulting business. Nora did not know about this in 2015. What she knew was that the valley was increasingly organized around a single corporate relationship, that the terms of that relationship were controlled entirely by a company in another state, and that the 22 farming operations in Harlan Creek Valley were, season by season, becoming more dependent on inputs they could not source elsewhere. She thought about this sometimes, standing on the dike in the early morning. She thought about it the way you think about weather on the horizon, something moving towards you that you cannot stop and can only prepare for. In the spring of 2016, she received a call from a buyer at a specialty food distributor based in Chicago. He had seen the Kansas State Laboratory report, which had been included as a case study in a wetland agriculture research bulletin that circulated among food industry professionals. He asked if she had additional grain from the Northwest section available for purchase. He said his company was supplying nutraceutical manufacturers who were looking for high antioxidant grain sources with documented provenance. She said she had approximately 4,000 pounds from the previous harvest still in storage. He quoted her a price of $4.70 per pound. She was quiet for a moment. He said, "Is that a problem?" She said, "No, that is not a problem at all." She sold the 4,000 pounds. She wrote the check number and the amount and the buyer's name in the notebook. She paid 3 months of loan payments at once for the first time since she had taken the loan out. She did not tell Walter. She did not tell anyone except Roy, who found out because he helped her load the truck. He looked at the check before she folded it and put it in her shirt pocket. He said, "That is not bad for a mud pit." She said, "We are just getting started." The 2016 harvest was the first year she turned a profit. It was small, roughly $9,000 after all operating costs, but it was positive and it was real, and it meant the calculation had changed. The field was approaching full establishment. The Northwest section was producing heavily. She had 3 buyers now, the specialty distributor in Chicago, and 2 others she had contacted through the research network, all of them interested in the documented nutritional profile of the grain from that corner of the field. She had expanded the reservoir by 2 acres that spring, investing in a second pump to give her more control over water timing. The reservoir was now holding roughly twice the water she needed for a single growing season. She had built it that way deliberately, not because she was anticipating a drought specifically, but because she had grown up watching Kansas weather, and she had learned enough about closed water systems in her conservation work to understand that resilience required redundancy. The winter of 2016 into 2017 was dry. Drier than average, the meteorologists said, though not alarmingly so. The wheat in the high field came up well enough. Cale published an optimistic outlook for the valley in the cooperative's spring newsletter. The Meridian contracts were renewed. The satellite soil maps showed good moisture in the top 18 inches across the primary growing areas. The summer of 2017 was a different story. It began dry and stayed dry and got drier. By July, the creek had dropped to a level that Walter said he had not seen since the early 1970s. The wheat in the high field began to show heat stress, the leaves curling inward at the edges, the grain heads filling unevenly. The other operators in the valley were pulling water from wells that had been adequate for decades and finding them slow to recover. The Meridian soybeans, which required consistent moisture during pod fill, were struggling across every field in the valley. Cale drove the county roads in his cooperative truck, stopping at field after field, adjusting recommendations in real time. He recommended supplemental irrigation from deep wells. He arranged for emergency pricing on water-intensive herbicide applications that he said would reduce plant stress. He was working hard, and he was visible, and the operators respected his effort, even as the crops declined. He drove past the field gate on Harlan Creek Road one morning in August and slowed down. The wild rice was green, Not stressed green, not the pale, washed-out green of a plant managing scarcity, but deep and full, the stalks standing straight. The water in the section sitting exactly where Nora kept it. 14 inches in the growing sections and deeper in the reservoir. The surface of the water catching the morning light and throwing it back in small, bright pieces. He sat in the truck for a long time looking at it. Then he drove on. The reservoir held through the entire drought. Nora ran her closed-loop system all summer, flooding sections in the heat of the day and drawing the water back into the reservoir at night, cycling it through the pump system in a rhythm she had developed over 6 years of working the field. The water she had been criticized for hoarding the oversized reservoir that the county road crew had joked about when they drove past. During construction turned out to be precisely the margin that made the difference. Her crop did not fail. It did not even struggle. The 2017 harvest was 114,000 pounds. She hired a proper water harvesting crew for the first time, 4 men with a larger harvesting boat, and they worked the field in 5 days, flooding each section in sequence and running the knock bar through the standing grain, while the hulls floated to the surface and the grain sank to the bottom, and the pumps moved the water to the next section in rotation. The northwest corner produced its heaviest yield yet. The grain was almost uniformly dark dense, unlike anything the distributors had seen from other sources. The gross revenue from the 2017 harvest was $209,000. She paid off the remaining loan balance in full on the 1st of October. She wrote the date in the notebook. Walter found out about the 2017 revenue. The way Walter found out about most things on the farm, through the accountant who handled both the wheat operation and Nora's bog separately, and who mentioned in passing during Walter's annual review that the low ground parcel had recorded a significant income event that year. Walter came to the field gate that evening. Nora was doing post-harvest maintenance on the pump system, replacing a seal that had worn during the summer. She heard the truck and looked up. He stood at the gate with his hands in his jacket pockets. He was 79 years old. He looked at the drain sections, the stubble of harvested stalks, standing a few inches above the waterline, the wide, flat surface of the reservoir in the low October light. He did not say anything about the money. He said, "Looks like it was a good year." She said, "Yes, sir." It was. He stood there a minute longer. Then he got back in the truck and drove back up to the main house. She watched the truck until it disappeared around the bend in the county road. Then she went back to the pump seal. She was thinking about Ida again. She thought about Ida often in moments like that, the particular feeling of being understood by someone who was no longer alive to say so. The drought broke in late October, with 2 weeks of hard rain that recharged the wells and brought the creek back up, and came 2 months too late for the operators who had lost their soybean crops. The Meridian contracts had guaranteed purchase price, which meant the company bought what was produced regardless of volume, but the income from the 2017 season was significantly below projections across the valley. The questions about Meridian began that winter. They were not Nora's questions. She was not at the cooperative meetings, and she had no stake in the soybean contracts. The questions came from the operators themselves. The men who had signed on in 2015 and were now in year 3 of a 7-year commitment, looking at their balance sheets from the drought year and doing the arithmetic on what the remaining 4 years of the contract would require from them. Someone asked Cale about the price increase. In 2018, Meridian had announced a 34% increase in their proprietary seed cost, effective for the following planting season. The contract did not cap input costs. Cale had known this when he recommended the contracts. The fine print was clear to anyone who read it carefully, though not many people had. He told the operators that seed price adjustments were standard in any long-term commercial agriculture relationship, and that the projected returns still compared favorably to alternatives. One of the older operators, a man named Paul Briggs, who had been farming in the valley for 40 years, asked Cale directly whether he had any financial relationship with Meridian beyond his cooperative salary. Cale said no. The meeting moved on. But Paul Briggs did not forget the question or the answer. By early 2019, the operational cost of the Meridian system had increased enough that 3 of the valley's smaller operators were running negative on their soybean ground. The guaranteed purchase price was holding, but the input costs were consuming the margin. The contract still had 4 years remaining. There was no exit clause that did not involve penalties. The spring of 2019 was adequate for rainfall, but the summer came in hard and dry again. Not as severe as 2017, but persistent. The kind of dry that accumulates over weeks and does not announce itself as a crisis until the crops are already compromised. The deep wells were slower to recover from 2017 than anyone had expected. The aquifer that the valley's irrigation had drawn on for decades was not replenishing at the rate the geological surveys had predicted. Nora's reservoir was full. It was always full. She managed it that way. In August, Derek Cale requested a meeting with the Harlan County Water Management Board. Nora heard about the meeting from Roy, who heard about it from his brother who worked at the county road department. She drove to the county building on a Wednesday morning and sat in the back of the meeting room. Cal presented a proposal. He framed it carefully in the language of community and shared resources and collective resilience. He said the current drought conditions had created an inequitable distribution of water access across the agricultural producers of Harlan Creek Valley. He said that certain private water reserves within the valley represented a resource that, under the county's emergency drought, provisions could be made available to a broader pool of users. He did not say Nora's name. He said private water reserves within the valley. There was only one private water reserve of any significant size in Harlan Creek Valley. He proposed that the board consider invoking the county's emergency water sharing ordinance, which allowed for temporary reallocation of private water resources during declared drought conditions with compensation to the property owner at a rate set by the county assessor. The board members looked at their papers. The county assessor's rate for agricultural water was substantially below the operational cost of the infrastructure Nora had built to collect and store that water. She waited until Cale finished. Then she raised her hand. The board chair recognized her. She stood up. She said, "Before the board considers this proposal, I would like to submit a document for the record." She walked to the front of the room and placed a folder on the table in front of the board chair. Inside the folder was a photocopy of a document. The original was at home in a fireproof box in her office. The document was the purchase agreement for the Voss Farm property dated September of 1908, executed by her great-grandfather with the county land office. It was 11 pages of dense legal text in the formal language of early 20th century property law. And on page 7, in a handwritten addendum that had been separately notarized, was a clause specifying the water rights associated with the low-ground parcel along Harlan Creek. The clause read in the careful language of a county clerk who understood the value of water in a dry state that the holder of the low-ground parcel retained riparian water rights, in perpetuity defined as the right to collect, store, and use all surface water and precipitation falling on or draining through the described parcel non-transferable and not subject to division or reallocation without the express written consent of the parcel holder. The board chair read the page she had marked with a paperclip. He read it again. He passed it to the board member on his left. The room was quiet. Cale said, "Historical property addenda do not necessarily supersede current county water management ordinances." The board chair said, "That is a legal question that would need to go to the county attorney before this board takes any action." He tabled the proposal pending legal review. Nora picked up her copy of the document, nodded to the board chair, and walked back to her seat. Cale was looking at his laptop screen. He was typing something. He did not look at her. The legal review took 4 months. Cale hired a water rights attorney from Wichita, billing the cost to the cooperative's administrative budget without a specific line-item authorization from the board, a fact that Paul Briggs would later document carefully. The attorney filed a motion arguing that the 1908 addendum was superseded by the Kansas Water Appropriation Act of 1945 and subsequent amendments. Nora hired her own attorney from a firm in Topeka that specialized in agricultural property law. The retainer required every dollar of liquid capital she had available after the 2018 harvest. She mentioned this to Walter one evening at dinner. She said she needed to be straight with him about the financial situation. She said the legal costs were significant, and she was going into the winter with less margin than she wanted. He was quiet for a moment. He asked how much she needed to retain the attorney through the full proceeding. She told him. He was quiet again for longer. Then he said, "I will handle it." She said, "Dad, you do not need to do that." He said, "I know I do not need to." "Go to bed, Nora." 3 days later, a check arrived in her office. The memo line said your mother's land. She held the check for a long time before she put it in the bank. She did not know yet what he had done to get it. She would find out from the accountant in December the same way Walter found things out. He had sold the 1979 John Deere that had been in the equipment shed since before Nora was born. The one her grandfather had bought new and Walter had maintained with the reverence some men give to instruments they love. It had not run in 6 years. Walter had been keeping it against the idea that he might one day have the time to restore it. He had called a collector in Salina who had been asking about it for a decade, and he had sold it for $11,000 without telling anyone, and written the check the next morning. Nora found out and said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not have made it smaller than it was. The court ruled in January of 2020. The judge found that the 1908 addendum constituted a valid prior appropriation of riparian water rights predating the 1945 Act, and was therefore not subject to supersession under the Act's provisions. The emergency sharing ordinance did not apply. The water in the reservoir was Nora's water. Cale did not attend the ruling. He sent the cooperative's attorney, who took notes, and drove back to the valley without speaking to anyone. Paul Briggs had been talking to a former cooperative employee through the fall. The employee had information about the retainer arrangement between Cale and Meridian, documented in emails that the employee had kept copies of after leaving the organization. Briggs contacted the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Fraud Division in November of 2019. The formal investigation was opened in February of 2020. Cale was informed of the investigation in March. He was placed on administrative leave by the cooperative board pending the outcome. He did not leave the county immediately. He still lived in the rental house on the south side of town. He was still seen at the grain elevator and the diner. But he no longer attended cooperative meetings, and he no longer drove the county roads in the truck with the cooperative logo. The investigation would take most of a year. It was not a dramatic process. It was the slow machinery of administrative and financial review documents, requested and produced emails printed and organized in binders. A deposition in a conference room in Topeka on a Tuesday in August. Cale cooperated with the process. He had an attorney, and he was careful. And the outcome would not be a criminal matter, but a civil and professional one. A finding of undisclosed conflict of interest, a repayment order, a consent decree, prohibiting him from serving in a compensated advisory capacity for any agricultural cooperative in the state for 7 years. None of that was visible yet in the spring of 2020. What was visible was the reservoir still full and the wild rice establishing its 11th year in the bog, and Nora on the dike in the early morning with her notebook the same as every morning for a decade. She had a new round of laboratory results from the northwest corner. A researcher at a food science institute in Chicago had been following her crop since the distributor had connected them, and the most recent analysis had refined the earlier findings significantly. The grain from that section had a specific polyphenol profile, unlike any documented wild rice sample in the Institute's database. The researcher had written in the accompanying letter that he believed the profile was a product of the intersection of the original seed genetics, the specific peat chemistry of that section of ground, and the particular mineral composition of water from that stretch of Harlan Creek. He said it was not a product that could be replicated anywhere else. He said he had shown the results to 3 buyers in the specialty grain and nutraceutical markets, and all 3 had expressed serious interest in long-term supply relationships. She filed the letter in the manila folder with the rest of the field documentation. She wrote the date in the notebook. She walked back up the dike to the pump system to check the morning readings. The summer of 2020 was mild. The wheat in the high field came in well. The wild rice in the bog reached what Nora assessed as full maturity across the entire 19 acres. For the first time, the northwest corner producing at a level she had not seen before. The grain dense and uniformly dark. The stalks so close together in the established sections that walking through them was like pushing through a crowd. Walter turned 83 that summer. He was slower and he used a cane on uneven ground, and he no longer walked the high field every morning the way he used to. But on still evenings, he would sometimes sit on the porch of the main house and look south toward the low ground. The way the light changed over the water in the late afternoon, the way the birds worked the reed edges at dusk. Once in September, Nora came back from the field at dusk and found him sitting on the bench she had installed on the main dike years ago, the one facing the largest section of the bog. He was just sitting. He had walked down there by himself, which she had not seen him do in years. She sat down beside him. They watched the water in the fading light. The wild rice stalks stood still in the evening air, the grain heads dark and heavy. After a while, he said, "Ida would have liked this." She said, "I know." He said, "Your mother always said Ida was the smartest one who ever came to this farm." He did not say anything else. They sat until the light was gone. That fall, the buyer from the Organic Food Consortium contacted her agent for the first time. They had been watching the crop and the laboratory documentation for 2 years. They did not want to participate in an open auction. They wanted to make a preemptive offer for the full harvest before the October event. Her agent negotiated through September. The conversations were not dramatic. They were methodical and detailed, focused on the documentation and the provenance and the specific nutritional profile of the Northwest section grain. The consortium understood what they were buying. They were not buying wild rice. They were buying a documented and irreproducible source of a specific compound profile that their manufacturing partners had already incorporated into product development plans. The number they arrived at was specific, because the documentation was specific. It was not a round number. It was the kind of number that results from multiplying a precise quantity by a precise price and getting a precise result. Her agent called her with the final offer on a Wednesday morning in late September. She wrote the number in the notebook. She sat at the kitchen table for a moment. Then she called Roy and told him they were going to need the full water harvesting crew for the October event. She asked him to book the crew they had used the previous 2 years and add 2 more men if they were available. He asked if there was a reason for the extra crew. She said, "I want to make sure we get it all in." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She hung up the phone. She looked at the number in the notebook for a moment longer. Then she went out to do the evening pump check. There are nights that do not feel like the end of anything. They feel ordinary. They feel like every other night that came before them, the same dark fields and the same pump sounds and the same creak of the old farmhouse settling against the wind. And then the morning comes, and the world is different, and you understand that the ordinary feeling was the last one of its kind, and you did not know to hold on to it. The October auction fell on a Friday that year. Nora was up before 4, the same as every morning, checking the water levels in the sections that still held harvest depth flooding, writing the readings in the notebook by the light of a headlamp. The air was cold enough to see her breath. The stars were clear and very close, the way Kansas stars get in October, when the humidity has finally left the air, and there is nothing between the ground and the sky but cold and distance. She had the numbers ready. She had the documentation organized in a manila folder, the laboratory reports in chronological order, the provenance chain for the northwest section, grain going back to the original seed stock in the tin, a chain of custody that her attorney had helped her formalize over the previous 2 years into something that would satisfy the consortium's compliance requirements. She had the harvest totals from Roy's final count, 212,000 pounds, the largest yield the bog had ever produced. She drove back to the house at 5:15. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark with the notebook open to the page where she had written the number her agent had given her. She had been looking at that number for 3 weeks. It had not stopped looking improbable in that time. It still looked like something someone had made a mistake writing. She checked the arithmetic again, the way she always checked arithmetic, slowly twice with a pencil. The pencil gave the same answer the calculator had given the first time. She closed the notebook. She went upstairs to change. She knocked on Walter's door at 6. There was no answer. She opened the door. The room was tidy in the particular way it had been since her mother died. Not the tidiness of someone who had just cleaned it, but the settled stillness of a room that had found its permanent arrangement. The bed was made. The curtains were open. Walter was in the bed with his hands folded across his chest and his eyes closed, and the expression on his face that she would spend the rest of her life trying to find language for something between finished and at rest, something that had nothing of struggle in it. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand on his hand and stayed there in the quiet while the light came up slowly outside the window, the field and the bog and the reservoir coming out of the dark in stages, the way the land always came back in the morning piece by piece, the way it had been coming back every morning on this farm for 120 years. She called the county medical examiner at 6:30. She called Gene Pritchard at 7, because Gene was the person you called in Harlan County when something happened that required a neighbor to know. Gene said he would come over. She said thank you, and she meant it, and she asked him to come after 9 because she needed a little time first. She sat with Walter until the light was fully up. She thought about the John Deere he had sold. She thought about the check in the memo line. She thought about him at the field gate in his truck in the fall of 2012, sitting there without getting out. She thought about the bench on the main dike and the evening he had walked down there by himself, and she had found him watching the water in the fading light. She thought about what he said about Ida. She thought about a man who spent 50 years being wrong about 19 acres and never said so directly, and never needed to, because the way he sat on that bench in the evening light said everything that a man like Walter Voss was capable of saying about the distance between what he had believed and what turned out to be true. She went downstairs at 8 and called her attorney and then her agent and told them both what had happened. Her agent asked if she wanted to postpone. She said no. She said Walter had known about the auction and had planned to be there, and she intended to go. Her agent was quiet for a moment and then said he would see her at the hall. She drove to the auction at 9:30 in the same mud-caked boots she wore every morning. She did not change them. She thought Walter would have found that appropriate. The Harlan County Annual Harvest Auction was held in the community hall on the west side of town, a building that had been used for this purpose every October, for as long as anyone could remember. The folding chairs were set in rows facing a low stage. The auctioneer's table was at the front. A whiteboard on the left side listed the day's lots in the order they would be presented. Coffee was available on a folding table along the back wall. The room smelled the way it always smelled in October: dry hay and diesel, and the particular sharpness of men who had been working since before sunrise. There were perhaps 90 people in the hall when Nora arrived. She knew most of them by sight, if not by name. She took a position near the back wall by the fire exit, the same place she had stood for 3 years running. She did not take a seat. She set her folder on the small shelf along the wall behind her and put her hands in her jacket pockets. The auction ran through its early lots without incident: wheat grades and prices. A late-season hay offering from 2 properties on the north side of the valley. A specialty grain lot from a farm she did not know well, that drew moderate interest and sold at a price that was adequate but not remarkable. Derek Cale was in the room. She noticed him when she came in. He was seated about 6 rows from the front on the right side, wearing a canvas jacket and a baseball cap that was not a cooperative cap. He was thinner than she remembered from the last time she had seen him at a distance, which had been months ago. The investigation had concluded in August. The consent decree had been filed in September. He was still living in the county as far as she knew, though she had heard from Jean that he had been looking at property in another part of the state. He did not look toward the back when she came in, or if he did, she did not see it. Paul Briggs was near the front talking to 2 other operators she recognized as longtime cooperative members. The mood in the room among the farming families was the particular, careful optimism of people who had been through a hard several years and were trying to locate the edges of something better, without believing in it too completely yet. The Meridian contracts had another 2 years to run. The consent decree had named the financial harm done to the cooperative, but had not undone the contracts. The valley was still working through the consequences of what Cale had arranged. She watched the room and did not think about any of that. She was thinking about Walter. She was thinking about how he had planned to sit in one of those folding chairs this morning, and she had not thought to ask him which one. She thought it would have been somewhere near the middle. Not the front, because that was for people who wanted to be seen. Not the back, because that was for people who were not sure they belonged. Somewhere in the middle, where a man who had farmed the same ground for 50 years and paid his taxes and minded his business and been right about almost everything for most of his life would naturally settle himself to watch his daughter's work be measured. There was a chair in the middle that was empty. She did not look at it too long. The auctioneer shuffled his cards. He cleared his throat. He said he had one more item before the close of the morning session, something a little out of the ordinary, and he would ask for the room's patience while he read through the lot description. He had the consortium's preemptive bid documented on a single white card. He read the provenance summary that her agent had prepared: the 19 acres of reconstructed wetland bog on Harlan Creek, the 11-year establishment, the documented nutritional profile of the Northwest section grain, the total harvest weight of 212,000 pounds. He read it in the flat professional voice of a man who reads lot descriptions for a living and does not typically editorialize. Then he read the price. He said the preemptive bid was set at $1.84 per pound for the full lot. He paused. He said the total consideration at that price for 212,000 pounds was $390,080. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people listening. Not the temporary quiet between one lot and the next. The other kind of quiet. The kind that happens when a number lands in a room and the people in the room begin to understand what it means and the understanding takes longer than the sound of the number itself. You could hear the fluorescent lights in the ceiling. You could hear someone near the front shift in their chair. You could hear very faintly the sound of the creak somewhere outside the building. Derek Cale had stopped looking at the stage. He was looking at the program in his hands. He took a pen from his jacket pocket and wrote something on the back of the program. He wrote it again. He looked at what he had written for a long time. He had divided $390,080 by 19. The number he had written was $20,526 per acre. He wrote it a third time as if repetition might change it. It did not change. It was more than 3 times the per-acre revenue he had projected for optimized soybean production on comparable ground. It was more than twice what the valley's best wheat ground had produced in its best recent year. It was the result of 11 years of work on 19 acres that he had told the woman at the back of the room were an economic tragedy and a monument to irrational decision-making. He set the program down on his knee. He did not look toward the back of the room. Paul Briggs turned in his seat and looked at Nora. He was not smiling exactly. It was a more serious expression than that. It was the expression of a man who had spent several hard years watching something go wrong in a place he cared about, and who was now watching something go right, and understanding that the two things were related in ways that would take time to fully trace. He nodded once. She nodded back. The auctioneer asked if there were any competing bids on the lot. There were not. He said, "Sold to the consortium. Congratulations to the Vosbog." A few people began to applaud. It was not loud applause. It was the careful applause of people who were not quite sure of the protocol for a moment like this one. But it was real. And it spread through the room in the way that genuine things spread a little unevenly without coordination, because it was not performed. Nora looked at the empty chair in the middle of the room. She did not smile. She did not raise a hand or acknowledge the applause or look at anyone in particular. She reached back to the shelf behind her and picked up the manila folder. She gave the auctioneer a small nod, a confirmation, a signal that the paperwork was in order and the deal was complete. Then she walked out of the hall into the October morning. She stood by her truck in the parking lot. The air was cold and still, and the sky was the particular flat blue of Kansas in October, a blue that goes all the way to the edges. She could hear the creek from here if she listened. She had always been able to hear it from this parking lot, and she had never thought about it before. Gene Pritchard came out of the hall a few minutes later. He walked across the gravel lot and stood near her. He did not say anything for a moment. He was 79 years old, and he had known her father for 50 years, and he had known Nora since she was 6, and he understood the texture of a morning like this one, without needing it explained. He said he knew it was going to be something. She said, "I think he did." Gene said, "He told me last week. He said he did not know what the number was going to be, but he said he knew it was going to make the room quiet." She looked at Gene. Gene said, "He said it the way Walter said things, like it was just a fact he had worked out." She nodded. She did not trust herself to say anything else right at that moment. Gene put his hand on her shoulder briefly, and then took it away the way men of that generation express things they did not have vocabulary for. Then he went to his truck. She drove home. Roy was at the field when she arrived. He was doing post-harvest maintenance on the sections they had drained the previous week, checking the dike integrity before the fall rains came. He saw her truck and walked up to the main dike. He could read her face the way he had learned to read it over 11 years of working the same ground together. He said, "How did it go?" She said, "It went the way it was supposed to go." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "And Walter?" She said, "He passed this morning, before I left." Roy took his hat off. He held it in both hands and looked at the ground. He was not a man who cried easily, and he did not cry then. But something moved across his face that was not simple. He said, "I am sorry, Nora." She said, "Thank you, Roy." They stood there for a moment with the bog around them, the water still in the sections that were flooded, and the stubbled stalks standing in the drain sections in the reservoir, full and flat, and catching the October light. Then she said, "I want to walk the northwest corner before we close it up for the season." He put his hat back on. He said, "Yes, ma'am." They walked the dike together to the northwest corner. The section where the peat ran deepest, where Ida's seeds had found the particular combination of water and chemistry and mineral character that had produced something the food science laboratory in Chicago had said existed nowhere else. The harvest was done. The water in that section was drawn down to a few inches. The stubble was dense and very dark, the remnant stalks standing close together in the shallow water. She stood at the edge of the section for a long time. She was thinking about what the researcher in Chicago had written, that the profile was not replicable, that it was a product of the intersection of the original seed genetics, the specific chemistry of that section of ground, and the particular mineral composition of water from that stretch of Harlan Creek. She was thinking that Ida had known all of this 120 years ago, without the vocabulary to say it in those terms. She had known it the way you know a place that reminds you of home. She had known it with her feet and her hands, and her understanding of what water does when you stop fighting it and let it be what it is. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the tin. She had been carrying it with her every day since she found it in the cedar chest. She did not open it often. She opened it now and looked at the seeds that remained inside the ones she had not planted, a few dozen kernels of dark, wild rice that had been sitting in this tin since before Nora's grandmother was born. She thought about the note. She had long since memorized it. The low ground knows what it is. Don't fight it. Feed it. She closed the tin and put it back in her pocket. Roy was watching her from a respectful distance, the way he always gave her space when she was thinking. She said, "We are going to expand the northwest section by 2 acres next spring." He said, "I figured." She said, "And I want to put another bench on this dike, facing west." He looked where she was looking toward the main house at the top of the rise, the old white farmhouse with its porch and its particular place against the sky. He said, "That is a good spot for a bench." They walked back up the dike together in the quiet October morning. In the weeks that followed after the paperwork was signed and the consortium's payment cleared, and the loan on the bog and the mortgage Walter had been carrying since 2008 were both retired in full. Nora did something that surprised the people who expected her to do something dramatic with the money. She did not buy new equipment, or a different truck, or a larger house. She did not move. She did not hire a manager or bring in outside capital, or allow the consortium to discuss a formal long-term supply agreement of the kind that would have required her to expand production beyond what the natural system could sustainably provide. She bought the 22 acres of degraded wetland immediately downstream from the bog, the acres that Harlan Creek ran through before it left her property, and she put them into a permanent conservation easement through a land trust that would hold the water rights and the habitat in protected status regardless of what happened to the farm in future years. She paid Roy and Denny a bonus that made both of them very quiet for a moment when she told them the amount. She put them both on full salaries with benefits the first time either of them had worked a salaried position in their careers. She invested in a new sorting and grading machine for the northwest section grain, a piece of equipment that would allow her to document the provenance of each batch from field section to final packaging, the kind of traceability the nutraceutical market required. and that she had been doing manually in her notebooks since the beginning. She continued to live in the farmhouse. She continued to sleep in the room with the view of the bog. She continued to check the water levels every morning before dawn, writing the readings in the notebook by the light of a headlamp. Ben Voss came home that November. He was the son of Nora's older brother who had left the county years before and built a life in another state and maintained a warm but distant relationship with the farm. Ben was 22 and in his final year of a business degree and had been following the news about the auction from a distance the way young people follow things through phone screens and second-hand accounts. He called Nora after the auction and said he wanted to come out and see the farm. She said he was welcome anytime. He arrived on a Saturday morning in a small sedan that was not built for county roads. He was tall like Walter had been and had the particular look of a young man who had grown up in cities and understood the world primarily through interfaces. He shook Nora's hand at the door and looked at the farmhouse and looked at the fields and said that it was bigger than he had imagined. She poured coffee and they sat at the kitchen table. He had questions. They were smart questions. The questions of someone who had been studying business and who was trying to understand the financial structure of what had happened here. He asked about the per-acre revenue. He asked about the input costs relative to the soybean operations in the valley. He asked about the consortium relationship and whether she had considered forming a formal entity around the brand value of the provenance documentation. She answered his questions. She was patient with them and she took them seriously because they were serious questions. Then he asked her something different. He had been looking at his coffee cup while he asked the other questions, and when he asked this one, he looked up. He said, "Why did you not just do what Cale said? When he came out here in 2011 and gave you the soybean projection, the numbers he was showing were not bad numbers. You would have made money." She thought about it for a moment. She said, "The numbers were not bad numbers. He was right about that." She said, "But the numbers were answers to the wrong question. He was asking what this land could be made to produce. I was asking what this land already was. Those are not the same question, and they do not lead to the same place." Ben was quiet. She said, "Cale was not a stupid man. He was a smart man, asking the wrong question with a lot of confidence. That is more dangerous than a stupid man asking the right questions slowly." Ben looked at his coffee. He said, "How did you know which question was the right one?" She thought about the tin in her jacket pocket. She thought about Ida, a woman who came from the lake country of Wisconsin to the wheat plains of Kansas and looked at a wet, acid field beside a creek and recognized it the way you recognize the face of someone you knew before you had language for knowing. She said, "Someone showed me a long time ago." She took the tin out of her pocket and set it on the table. He looked at it. He asked what it was. She said, "It is 120 years of patience." And a very good question asked by someone who was not listened to until now. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He read the tape on the lid. He set it down gently the way you set down something when you understand it is not yours to put down carelessly. He said, "Can I come back in the spring?" She said, "You can come back when the water goes in. That is the part worth seeing." He came back in May. He came back in work clothes that time, and boots that were adequate if not yet broken in, and he worked the field with Roy for 3 weeks, laying irrigation pipe in the expanded northwest section, learning to read the water depth. Rod learning to tell the difference between standing water and moving water. By the way the light sat on the surface, he was a quick learner, and not too proud to ask questions twice if he had not understood the first time. Roy said he had potential, which from Roy was a considered assessment and not a casual compliment. He went back to finish his degree in August. He called Nora from school twice that fall. The first call was about a course he was taking on sustainable agriculture economics, and he had questions about the provenance documentation system. The second call was shorter. He said he had decided that when he graduated, he wanted to come back to Harlan County. Not to take anything over and not to change anything, just to learn. She said, "The low ground will still be here." He said, "I know. That is why I'm coming." She hung up the phone. She was at the kitchen table with the notebook open and the coffee going cold the way it always did when she was writing. The evening light was coming through the window from the west. The same light that had come through that window for 120 years falling across the table, and the notebooks in the tin that she had moved from her jacket pocket to a shelf above the window, where it could catch the light every evening. The farm was quiet. The bog was quiet. The creek ran the same as it always had, moving water from one place to another without drama or announcement, doing what water has always done in the low ground along Harlan Creek, which is to say, it did what it was. She thought about a woman named Ida, who had come to this place in 1901, and looked at the low ground and seen it clearly, and put her knowledge in a tin, and trusted that eventually someone in the family would be ready to find it. She thought about the note. She had read it so many times that the original was fragile now, the paper worn at the folds, and she had made a careful copy in her own handwriting in the front of the first notebook. The low ground knows what it is. Don't fight it. Feed it. She turned to a fresh page in the current notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote the water depth from the morning reading. She wrote the air temperature. She wrote the name of the buyer who had called that afternoon about next year's harvest. The third buyer to call in as many weeks. All of them following the research documentation that was now being cited in 3 separate publications in the food science and nutritional biochemistry literature. She wrote everything down the way she always had, by hand in pencil in a notebook that would sit on the shelf with the others when it was full. The record of what this place was and what it had produced and who had listened to it when listening was the only thing that made any difference. Outside the window, the last of the October light was leaving the sky over the high field. The bog was going dark in the way it always went dark slowly and without drama, the water holding the light a few minutes longer than the land around it, before it too let go. She kept writing.